Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this evening. I've just started the webinar to bring you guys in, but if you just wait a few more moments, we'll wait for some more folks to join us, and then Rachel and I will make a start. So thank you very much. Hi, for those of you just joining, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're just going to wait a few more moments for some other folks to join us, and then Rachel and I will make a start. To have a few more people joining. Thank you so much for joining this evening. We'll just wait one more minute, I think, and then we will make a start promptly. Got lots to go through this evening, as you can imagine, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time left at the end for valued questions and answers. So just, yeah, we'll give it one more minute and then we'll begin. Brilliant. Let's make a start then. So again, thank you all so much for joining this evening and for your valuable time in wishing to join us to hear from Rachel about the ideal Ivy League candidate. So we have lots to get through and no doubt there'll be lots of questions. So on that note, please may I invite you to use the Q&A function or the chat function to place your questions throughout the call. Rachel will address questions at the end of the presentation. The presentation itself should last around 40 minutes, so it leaves plenty of time at the end then for questions and answers before we come to a close. But just to introduce ourselves, so my name is Hayley, and I'm one of the senior university advisors here for A-List Education, which is part of the Dukes Plus family of university consultancies here in the United Kingdom. So you can see there in the bottom red banner, you will see our sister consultancies, including Oxbridge Applications, the Medic Portal, and the Lawyer Portal. And together we are one family supporting students to apply to universities and courses all around the world, not least the US, which is why we're here this evening. So A-List started over 20 years ago in our New York office. A team of Ivy League graduates came together and wanted to support students to achieve their dream of accessing US universities. And the ethos that we work with is to use this application process not only as a tick box exercise in choosing universities to go to, but genuinely as a catalyst for a student's own personal growth and benefiting from the application process itself. So our office now is based in London, and we as a UK team work with top schools and students from across some of the country's biggest and most notable schools. And we have therefore deep insights into what it takes to be successful in this process. Independently, we work with students all around the world as well. And as part of the Dukes Plus team, together, we are trusted by over 80% of the UK's top schools, as well as a significant number of schools worldwide as well. So thank you all so much for joining. That was just to preface this conversation with a bit more about A-List, and I'm really happy to answer any more questions at the end. But without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce to you Rachel. Rachel will be taking forth the rest of this session. And then, as I said, we have plenty of time at the end for any questions and answers that you may have. So thank you so much, Rachel. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Haley. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Lau. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California, but currently based in London. I'm a former American attorney, double barred, and I've had experience In the back end, both accepting students at law school and also now currently on the front end, working with students internationally who are aiming to gain acceptance to American universities. Today, we're going to be talking about what the ideal candidate for an Ivy League university looks like. So, just to start off, we'll introduce Ivy League universities in general. We'll go over what is called the holistic admissions process. So, that's the way in which they accept students. We'll talk about the academic benefits of starting early. Additionally, opportunities to take standardized testing and what that looks like now. We'll definitely discuss crafting the best possible essay, strategic decision making, and what to do next. And then, as Haley mentioned, we'll review some questions at the end. So, I'm sure most of you are here attending this webinar to learn more about Ivy League universities. So, I think it would be smart to start with a general overview of what the Ivy League universities are. It's a group of 8 universities that I'm sure most of you are well aware of the names of. And 4 of them listed here are Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia. Um, I think it's interesting to note that although the Ivy League universities kind of get lumped together in a group, all of them have very distinct identities as universities. And I like to remind students that even though these are incredibly prestigious universities, not all of them are one and alike. So, for example, Harvard, located in Cambridge, is more directed towards a student who is looking towards flexibility, but also one who really wants to engage in a city campus. Yale is a university in Yale's a university focused more on humanities, writing, and discussions. Princeton is a small university located in New Jersey, and they are only undergraduates. So they're actually more focused on research and very, very rigorous academics. Columbia in New York City is more global, policy oriented, and really engages with an urban environment. And even looking at these 4 universities, you can see that they're so distinct from one another, not only in terms of education and their specialties, but also in terms of location. So it's really good when students are applying to Ivy League universities to really understand thoroughly the distinction between all of them. I think a lot of students naturally are really interested in the prestige of the universities, and I think that is really fair. I will say that because the universities are so different, that typically, it's not necessarily advisable for every single student to apply to every single Ivy. They all have their very own unique identities. And we can talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, which goes over the other 4 Ivy League universities that we're talking about. So that's UPenn in Philadelphia, Brown, Dartmouth, and Cornell. UPenn is a university located in Philly, and they're more focused in business, career oriented, and business minded. It also encourages interdisciplinary problem solving. Brown famously has a student driven learning program in which the students have the option to self select their curriculum. They don't have any core requirements, and the students are really encouraged to be individual and creative and collaborative amongst themselves. Dartmouth is a smaller university located in Hanover, New Hampshire, and I typically recommend Dartmouth for any individual who really wants a small community, values mentorship, a close community with a deep emphasis on experiential learning. And lastly, Cornell, located in Ithaca, New York, and it's definitely more STEM heavy, and also importantly, is a very rural university. So, kind of as we reviewed the general outlines of these 8 universities, in fact, again, I want to remind I guess both students and parents that no student typically will be a fit for every single Ivy. And sometimes it can be a mistake to apply to all of them because it feels inauthentic. So, for example, typically an individual who's really interested in Cornell, who would prefer a more rural environment, that might not be a great fit with a university like Columbia, which is incredibly urban, really integrated with the city of New York City, and separate in that it doesn't have as large of a isolated campus. And so again, I think the first step in applying to Ivies and being an ideal Ivy League candidate is really understanding the nuances and the differences between these universities. Now, after you've heard these 8 universities, you might be wondering, what about Stanford or what about MIT? And those aren't actually in the league of universities that are called Ivy Leagues, even though those universities are still equally, if not more, competitive. So, for example, how do Ivies compare on admissions rate? This is kind of a chart of the acceptance rates of different universities, and you'll see that the number one most I guess, elite in terms of acceptance university is actually Caltech, which is non-Ivy. But I think that this chart really demonstrates the point I made earlier, which is universities that are not Ivies could potentially be a really, really great fit for you or your student, and could actually be almost a better fit. They might not necessarily be in the Ivy League, but they're still probably as competitive, if not more competitive, and in all likelihood, potentially a better fit if you're only chasing prestige. So I think this is an interesting list because it does name a lot of exclusive schools that maybe don't come to mind when you think about the Ivies, and it really exclusive competitive universities. And I think that's also somewhere that a list can really demonstrate value because, for example, a lot of our clients are international, and they've never heard of, for example, Pomona, number 17 on this list, extremely exclusive, really science-based, incredible university. And if you're kind of applying from abroad, only knowing the Ivy League, you miss out on these kind of hidden gems that I think potentially could be a way better fit for your student. So I think that just kind of paints a picture of the landscape of competitive and exclusive universities in the States. And after we've reviewed all of that, you must be wondering, how do I get into these Ivy League schools and what does the admissions process look like? And I like to remind students and parents alike that um, universities in the States, unlike universities in the UK, have a holistic admissions process. What does that mean? That means that university decisions are made based on a composite of a number of different elements. So here you have school profile, academic transcript, background information, application type, your standardized testing scores, interviews, supplemental essays, personal statements, demonstrated interest, letters of recommendation, and extracurriculars. Now, that is a long and extensive list of factors, and I totally understand that to the outside person, it might be quite overwhelming to see that and think that you're going to be, compared amongst all of these different elements. However, I typically think it's really a benefit for our students, especially our multifaceted students who are trying to apply to the Ivy Leagues. I will say, once you get to the caliber of student who is applying to the Ivy Leagues, in all honesty, their academic transcripts and their standardized testing scores all are kind of the same. I typically look at it more as a check mark or a benchmark rather than a distinguishing factor because, again, once you reach the caliber of student who is applying to the Ivy Leagues, you're going to get students who have near perfect SAT scores or perfect SAT scores and near perfect or perfect academic transcripts. So I think that when you're thinking about what makes you different and what is a differentiating factor that could make you a viable candidate for the Ivy League, I think the holistic admissions process is actually a really positive element. So, for example, a student with an amazing personal statement or with really compelling supplemental essays or really integrated with their interview process and the alumni network in their city, all of that can really help make a student differentiate themselves on top of what is essentially a given, which is incredible grades and incredible scores. Something that I really like to point out here that's really distinct from UK universities is that element of demonstrated interest. And a lot of universities, and in particularly the Ivy League, because they have so many applicants, they're really keen to see that you are interested in them specifically. And that's kind of again why I caution students against applying to every single Ivy League school, because that doesn't necessarily show the demonstrated interest. Universities want to see that, you know, you've attended their info sessions, you've taken a tour, you've connected with their alumni network. And in all honesty, I typically tell students that this benefits them as well, because once they get to know more about the university, you know, for example, if you're getting to know more about Cornell, you can always say, oh, actually, you know, I don't know if I can survive these cold winters in this rural environment. And that's definitely a factor when you think about US universities, which last 4 years of your you know, pretty pivotal time of your life. And so I always encourage students that this element of demonstrated interest is kind of an unknown X factor that can really work in their favor, especially if they're trying to differentiate themselves. So now again, we're looking at what are the Ivy League admissions trying to build. Importantly, the Ivy Leagues are trying to build a class and not individuals. And that essentially asks the question of, they're not trying to accept just the top, you know, students with the top grades and the top scores alone. We're not really asking how impressive the student is, but actually what they could add to the class and add to the campus. And I always try to remind students and parents that at the end of the day, universities, especially and particularly the Ivy League, would love if their students and their graduates went off in the world and they would able to proudly say, you know, that was our UPenn grad or that was our Columbia grad. And if you think about it through that lens, I think you can really lock into an element that can make your application stand out, because you will have, you know, a different intellectual voice, a different cultural perspective, a different academic interest or leadership style that you can contribute. So I always think of these classes as kind of iterative. So they grow upon each other and they build upon each other. And admissions decisions groups are really considering, like, how can we kind of create and form a class that's going to make the best impact and importantly make us look better. And at the end of the day, that's a lot of what Ivy League admissions are really considering. How do students complement the others already admitted, and how can they again really add? What they don't necessarily want is just another high achieving student with no clear role, no clear voice. And they're really looking towards initiative and leadership. Additionally, they're looking at long-term commitment to causes or communities. And I'll touch about this a little bit when we talk about benefits of starting early. But when you are applying to the Ivy Leagues, you're really thinking about how you have left a mark upon your community, your school, or anything like that. And that is really only possible when you've made a long term commitment to a group in which you've shown and demonstrated leadership. One of the benefits of starting early is that you are able to kind of grow those roots and you avoid what we call activity panic in kind of the final years of school, which I do see sometimes where students think, wow, I have to apply for university. I'm going to join 7 different clubs. I'm going to be just a participant in all of them, and that'll show them that I'm dedicated. And I actually think that that's not the right way to go about it, because again, extremely elite universities, especially the Ivy League, they're looking for students who can really make change and not necessarily someone who is just come a participant. And so I think any opportunity in which you can influence, build, or improve systems is typically the best route. And if you're thinking about it, admissions is also strategic from the school's perspective. And so they have, for example, majors that are a little less popular, debate teams that need filling, publications that need need journalists to write for. And because of that, they do enroll students that are interested in less popular majors or fulfill a certain need that maybe is not expected. And they also really try to balance class size. So, another interesting example of that is Brown University, which typically and historically has been, I think, overwhelmingly female. And I think previously there have been a lot of efforts to kind of make that gender norm a little more equal. And those are definitely factors to consider when you're thinking about applying to the Ivy Leagues. I will also say that um, my experience is that admissions counselors can really see whether something has been authentic or whether something is merely a title. So they're really looking for someone who is able to move things forward. Importantly, has a student seen a gap somewhere, and are they able to act without being told? And importantly, did others follow? Right. And so you want to look at demonstrated leadership through action and influence, not a mere label. And that's really how you kind of distinguish yourself in the extracurricular realm when you think about yourself and your applicant profile as a whole. Now, when we look at Common App components, there are all these number of components that go on what is called the Common Application process, which is kind of a general site in which these universities use to have students apply. And that will have your profile. So that's your demographic information, your family, parents, siblings, importantly, legacy information, your education, schools attended, summer schools, awards, testing, activities, again, important, particularly in terms of the depth and leadership opportunities, writing, which is a main area in which A-list advisors can help students with their personal statement writing, with their supplemental essays, kind of forming the narrative that will become a compelling reason to say, hi, my name is Rachel, and this is exactly what I'm going to do and how I can improve the campus. And then, of course, your counselor letter or letters of recommendation. In this part, I'm going to be talking about benefits of starting early, in which I described before in terms of the activity panic that we kind of see. And I think that touches a little bit on how you develop your profile as an applicant. So again, this slide definitely states that everyone applying to the Ivy League kind of has the same pretty excellent scores and grades. And so, how can you differentiate yourself? If you look here at this example of this student, Oliver, there you can see some of their extracurriculars. So, for example, there's a lot of leadership opportunities here. They were a founder, which is really, really important because that identifies that they've kind of seen a gap, seen somewhere where they can make a difference. And that's a really important element. They're also a chair. And so they've established an outreach group and reached 800 plus students and coordinated a team. And I think most parents are pretty familiar with how to phrase these CVs. I think most students really need to be reminded that the element that Ivy League universities are looking for are the outcomes, right? So you really want to see that we've reached 800 plus students. You know, we've seen a gap, we've identified it, and I've led a team. And I think that will really allow students to set themselves above and beyond. Here, there's also another leadership opportunity being had in the captain of the school debate team, and I will say that these are pretty long time frames as well, and as well as senior prefect. And so I think the earlier you can kind of draw on these opportunities and see what your student is really interested in, the more authentic these leadership opportunities will become. So I think that most students, especially when they start in high school or with their GCSEs, in all honesty, a lot of them might not know what they want to do. And that's, again, the benefit of starting early is kind of this trial and error, so that when we come to the more critical times, like a little bit later, year 10, year 11, students can really know what they're interested in and see a difference and kind of jump on that opportunity to make a change. And all of that can only happen if you start early and you have the time and the experience to know, what is missing and how you can really make an impact. Importantly, I also like to emphasize that it's really, really important to universities that you demonstrate acts of service to your local community, sports, arts, and summer experiences. I would say that pretty much most supplemental essays, which we'll touch on later, really encourage a student to look into how they have affected their community in a positive way. And I think that that's always a key to look forward to and something that you can really develop over time. Here we're going to talk about early application versus regular application. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but there are a number of different deadlines floating around. I like to work backwards and move forward. So the last of the deadlines is between January 1st and January 15th. So we've pretty much kind of come to the end of one cycle here. There are three different types of early applications that you can make. And why are these important? For me, I really like to highlight Dartmouth College, which is one of the prime examples of this. So if you look at regular acceptance rate, so that means someone who is applying at the January 1st deadline, the rate of acceptance at that date is 5%. And if you were to apply at their early deadline, which is November 1st, that rate of acceptance jumps fourfold. That's pretty impressive. And in my opinion, it really allows for the benefits of someone who starts early. If you're starting your Common App writing process in October and you're only just starting to really think about, the elements that have changed you and ways that you've affected your community, typically you're not able to get that level of depth, that level of growth in an essay with that short amount of time, which is again why I always recommend students to start early, because at the end of the day, if there is a four-fold times likelihood that you will be accepted to Dartmouth, let's say the college of your dreams, I always recommend that students prepare for that early. If we go into the finer details, there are three different types of early applications. Some of them are binding and some of them are non-binding. I have I have parents actually ask me regularly, can I just apply to, 15 universities early? And typically I discourage against that. One, because two of the types of early applications prevent that. So early decision is binding, which means that if you are admitted, you are legally obligated to accept the offer. And as a lawyer, I'm very strict about things like that. So that means that you can really only apply to one early decision. You're allowed to apply to some early action, but typically, if you're applying to early decision, then that's only one university. Regular early action is not legally binding, which means you can apply to more than one. And then restricted early action means that is not legally binding, but you cannot apply to other private universities, but you can still apply to public universities. Now, I kind of lay out that landscape just to say to students, like, yes, I think if we looked at pure math, you'll be more likely to gain acceptance to a university if you apply early. I will caveat that with the factor of authenticity. I think if you're applying to, a dozen schools early, I don't think that speaks necessarily to a smart strategy, because it is a lot of preparation, or B, necessarily a level of authenticity, because I think it has been very few and far between that I've seen a student genuinely want to apply early and be accepted early to 12 different universities. So that's definitely a balancing act that we have to play in terms of strategy, and something that I think ALIS is really, really good at is providing the resources for you to figure out your strategy and which universities you want to apply to early and how many you want to apply to early. Another element is summer programs, and parents are always asking about summer programs. And I think that summer programs definitely have their benefit. They won't be indicative of a decision on your application, but I think it is a great experience if the student is really keen to learn the subject matter that's being taught, and B, if they've never been to the States, just trying to understand whether a university would be a great fit for them is always a benefit of a summer program. So now bringing back to Haley, who's going to talk more about work experience and how that's such an underrated asset. Again, it shows kind of the leadership aspects that I described earlier. And we are partnered with Invest In, which will talk more about that work experience.
Thank you, Rachel. So, work experience, as Rachel says, an example of going above and beyond the curriculum and can really help students to stand out. If students are solely focused on achieving as well as possible in their high school grades, doing what they need to do, what will just differentiate those that do extra are things that they do outside of the curriculum, like work experience. Investin is a sister company in our Dukes Plus family, an experience provider where students can join an immersive career experience for ages between 15 and 18. And there is an entire list of 15 different careers the students can explore and have tasters in. The aim of this, of course, is to develop students' awareness of the variety of careers available to them, give them a chance to test drive those, and make those informed decisions about what is their likely trajectory in their future career. And of course, then maximize their chances of being able to break into that field in an increasingly complex and competitive future. So if we move to the next slide, you can see here are some of the extra perks of the program that Invest In celebrate. Not only will students get a certificate, and let's face it, we all love a certificate. It's a really valuable extra for students to then get a reference letter and proof that they have, gained this valuable insight and internship opportunity of real workplaces, gaining hands-on experience with top professionals in their fields, whilst all meeting students from around the world whilst living in UCL halls of residence in London. So students can do this in the summer, and students can join for 1 or 2 week programs. It's in person in July and August, and will be happening this very summer. So students have the opportunity to live together in university accommodations, also getting to test drive that university experience as well as that of the work experience itself. And an added bonus for students who are thinking of applying to universities, and particularly for those in the UK as well. This experience is accredited and recognised by UCAS, and will therefore gain a level 3 award. So will add towards their academic portfolio of qualifications as well. So a huge, huge benefit of joining. And on a personal front, I often do deliver sessions for these work experiences for a lot of students in the medicine programs, and it is genuinely a highlight of their summers. So it's one example of work experience that students come to look at. So, of course, if there are any questions about this, then of course you can contact Invest In directly, or of course speak to myself at the end, or email A-List. You'll have the email address at the end, and we'll be delighted to refer you on. But how that looks in regards, as why we're here today, about Ivy League applications. So Rachel's already highlighted the holistic nature of admission selection in the US. They're looking for more than just good grades, but the well-rounded candidates who can demonstrate so much. Not only that academic commitment, but also the transferable skills and professional readiness to thrive, not only in an undergraduate degree, but after that as well. It shows maturity and a readiness to excel and push themselves into kind of maybe out of their comfort zone and to embrace these new opportunities for global exposure. So, in all, as you can see here, I think this would be a really exciting opportunity and one that we'd be very happy to share more information about should you have any questions or interest. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Haley. Um, Next, we're going to be talking about the all-important issue of standardized testing, which I know has been a hotbed of debate recently. And as you might be wondering, as many people wonder, do scores matter? And if so, which test should I take? I would say that especially coming from a UK background, standardized tests are still really, really important. And they're still one of the very few tools that admissions officers can use to compare students across very different school systems. So I'm sure, as many of you are aware, in the GCSE and A level system, students are taking like 3 classes and they'll get their grade based on those. In the States, they'll take, and even in IB programs, they'll take, for example, 6 courses. And a lot of admissions counselors do get quite confused when they only see 3 subjects. And so, whenever a student is applying to the Ivy League, I always advise that they take either the SAT or the ACT just so that they can, provide a baseline in which they can compare their competitiveness amongst other students. The tests themselves are used to assess whether a student is really academically prepared for the right pace, volume, and rigor of Ivy level coursework. And as much as there is debate in the zeitgeist now about whether these scores are matter, whether they're unfair, at the end of the day, the admissions counselors, they do really enjoy seeing them, and again can be used as a common benchmark and just a check mark to say that this student is probably prepared for the Ivy League. Additionally, and incredibly importantly, these scores are often important for scholarships because a great score can unlock potential merit based aid, can strengthen borderline cases, which is really important, and just help justify another institutional investment in a student. I will also say that a lot of test optional policies are expiring. And so, even though there was an exception made around 2020 for a lot of universities, now a lot of universities are trending back towards having a test requiring test scores. Um, I will also say that for the ideal Ivy League candidate, a student who has a low or missing score, it does tend to raise questions. And given that the both tests, the SAT and the ACT, are, in my opinion, not tests of necessarily knowledge possession, but of acknowledging patterns. The more SAT and ACT questions you see, the more likely you're going to be able to recognize that pattern and the more likely you'll be able to answer that correctly. And that is a tool that's definitely going to be used in a student's life throughout university. And definitely when I was taking the LSAT and both bar exams, they're definitely used throughout your kind of adult life. So I always like to remind students that tests don't necessarily get the students admitted because they're more of a benchmark, but at this level, they do explain why a student belongs. And that's an important takeaway. Between the SAT and the ACT, those are two slightly different standardized tests of pretty much the same caliber of difficulty. The ACT has an additional science component, and the SAT is a little more focused on reading and writing. And so I think if you're having confusion about which to take, I would definitely recommend talking to an A-list advisor, talking to Haley or Sam or myself, and definitely signing up for a diagnostic test. I think oftentimes students kind of underestimate the kind of X factor of taking a high pressure test. And the earlier you can have tools to address, potential anxiety regarding testing, the better. In terms of the Ivy Leagues in particular, this is a really helpful chart that states whether an SAT or ACT is required. And again, I will say that importantly, the vast majority of these universities require the test. Columbia is probably the only one that is permanently test optional, but a lot of pretty much again, all of these Ivy League universities require a test and do like to see them. Next, we're going to talk about the narrative behind an Ivy League essay. So earlier, when I was talking about the holistic admissions process, I know we discussed personal statements and supplemental questions. And so we're going to go into that now and discuss kind of the importance of framing that narrative around who you are as a student and what you can contribute to campus in these essays. Importantly, the UCAS system and the Common App system are really different because the UCAS system focuses more on the formal and concise reason of why a student has chosen a subject, where that passion lies. I will say that the US personal statement is definitely more narrative driven and allows and really encourages students to share their personal stories and their growth and their values through this essay. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think that when everyone's grades and SAT scores kind of are even, this is really where a student can make their impact and is really where A-list advisors can make their impact. Specifically, this is probably one of my favorite areas in which to work with students because it really identifies and area in which students can reflect on where they've come from and where they want to go. I think there's not many moments in life where students can really think about what's brought them there and really brainstorm on what they want to do and be aspirational in that sense. I will say that I was talking to another A-list advisor who wanted to get my feedback on a student who had pretty much perfect grades, perfect extracurriculars, and was still rejected from her top university. And he was asking me to kind of look at her personal statement, her supplemental essay. And I will say that unfortunately, it felt like her personal statement answered questions of what she thought a committee would want to hear. And I think, again, this is where I really, the rubber really hits the road for me when I work with my students, because a lot of them, having, gotten perfect grades most of their life, they know exactly what to say. But admissions decisions aren't made on what a student should say. Admissions decisions are really made on what does a student have to say that's unique and individual. And that does take a lot more reflection than you would think. A lot of my students come to me and they say, I aced this essay. I wrote it in a weekend. I'm sure I can write my Common App statement in one weekend. Don't worry about it, Rachel. And I really, really caution against that because I think this level of depth and reflection does take a few weeks, if not months, to really develop, why am I like this? Why have I thought this way? And what can I contribute? And that personal growth is really where I try to, encourage my students to grow because it is such an important part of the application and is, again, a really great moment to show who you are and show how you're different. Now, once you're done with the personal statement, most of my students will say, okay, great, I'm like 80% of the way done, right? And unfortunately, that's typically not the case. I would say that the vast majority of top universities require supplemental essays. And these, like, for example, this range of universities has a number of different questions that you can ask, and they're fairly deep questions. For example, Harvard asks, describe a time when you strongly disagreed with someone about an idea or issue. How did you communicate or engage with this person, and what did you learn from this experience? I think that questions like these, they actually take a lot more effort to answer than you would think. And if you're a student applying to 12 universities, once you finish your Common App personal statement, you still have perhaps 12 other essays to write. So I think that the Common App personal statement is only really half the battle. A large part of the other element of compelling a decisions committee to accept you is answering questions like this with the level of depth that touches on something that A, wasn't touched on in your personal statement, and B, again, demonstrates to the committee why you're a great fit for this university in particular, this Ivy League in particular. And I think it's important because even when you look at these two Ivy League universities in comparison to each other, for example, Harvard and Dartmouth has their famous Kermit the Frog question, that really gives you an indicator of what type of student Dartmouth wants and what type of student Harvard wants. And I think when you're looking at what makes a compelling Ivy League candidate and which Ivy League is appropriate for which student, I think these questions can be really interesting and indicative to understanding what a university wants to see. And these, as most questions do, I think these questions, reveal a lot about the person asking the question as much as it reveals about the person answering the question. So I've been talking a lot about kind of the different components of the admissions process, but ultimately, when we think about your approach to applying to an Ivy League university, we really need to think about a winning admission strategy. And that is all these components together, right? Timing, extracurricular activities, work experience, essays, and all of that. I think A-list is really great at, helping students with. I think it's really important to work with people who have a vast understanding of not only the types of universities, so, Ivy Leagues versus comparable Ivy Leagues, versus, what are considered, Ivy Leagues in the area. So Ivy League of the South, Ivy League of California, those elements. But so which schools to apply to, how your application compares, and how to really differentiate yourself as a student and as someone who's a viable competitor and a viable option for these Ivy Leagues. So I'll pop it over back to Haley, who's going to talk about how A-list can really help students with this.
Thank you, Rachel. So, absolutely, A-List is here to help students with multiple facets of the application, from initial advising, even speaking about subject choices and curriculum choices, to compiling essays, to thinking about shortlisting the different universities and colleges that they choose. So, we are here to help at multiple points. And the first port of call is looking at hopefully joining us for a private consultation. This is something which is an initial conversation with an A-list advisor, perhaps one of ourselves or a colleague in the team, to sit down and discuss with you your specific application. We can work together to ascertain your background to date, as well as what the next steps could look like to help make this dream of an Ivy League become a reality. So together we can devise that strategy. And as you can see there, the proof is in the pudding. Our students are 4.5 times more likely to get into the Ivy League than other candidates. Our acceptance rates are, as you can see there in the table, with relative likelihood, with significant multiplication factors included. So absolutely, we'd be very, very happy to speak with you further, to answer any questions today, of course, but to hopefully invite you for a private consultation in the future. In a future slide, we do have a discount code to honour you for having joined us today, and I'll show that at the very end. Rachel already mentioned about a diagnostic, and I think this is really, really vital to understand how to best strengthen your application. The SAT and ACT tests are two options to choose from. An anecdote I've heard a few years ago, which I do like recounting, is that it's almost like Pepsi versus Coca-Cola. They're kind of the same thing. It's the same thing. It's the same purpose, but one just has everyone has a favorite, and everyone just likes one of them for one reason or another. And it could be the science section, it could be the timing of the questions, it could be the phrasing of the questions. But to really find out which one works for you, a free diagnostic with us will help you on the best path to success. So contact us and reach out to us after this webinar to gain those instructions to be able to access these diagnostics and to really help you in which test are you most likely to thrive. Because every point that you can get in these tests can be that pivotal factor in gaining you a place or not. So we can be there to help you to decide which test out of the two will be the best for you. As I mentioned, the private consultation is the wonderful next place to start. And here, if you want to make a note of this, is the discount code that we have allocated today specifically for you. As you can see, webinar 2101 is the discount code you can use. So just quote this to us if you want to email, telephone us, or contact us on our website. And that will automatically then be of huge benefit to you as a gesture of thanks for joining us this evening. So we'll now move into a Q&A session, and thank you so much again to Rachel for a wonderful presentation there. We've had some questions coming in. I have some questions of myself as well. And if anyone else has any questions, please do add them to the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to go through them. So Rachel, I'll go through some questions now. And one of the ones we had quite early was, there was one slide you were on, I believe I did make a mental note of it. It was the one where you're talking about what are Ivy League admissions trying to build. And we had a question at the time referring to you talking about systems. I don't know if you can recall what you meant by systems on this particular slide. Might that have been about education systems, or
And systems. I'm not sure exactly. Oh, ability to influence, build, or improve systems. Maybe that is
There we
what
go.
the person is
Yeah,
asking about.
yeah.
So when we talk about your ability to influence, build, or improve systems, I think that that speaks to impact in terms of community-wide systems. So of course, it's important to influence, locally. But I think Ivy Leagues also really try to see students who are thinking globally, improving broader systems, because those are the type of students that they want to send out in the world. If you recall on that slide, I think this one, this student's CV, I think when you're thinking about how he has improved systems, he's reached 800 plus students from underrepresented backgrounds and gathered a team across multiple schools. So that means that he's expanded not only in his local school and his local community, but throughout a system, and is going to leave a lasting impact. And kind of another way I like to think about this is when you've left, will your lasting impact still be there? A lot of students, for example, they'll found a club and then they'll move on with their life in the university that they've gone to. And universities don't really enjoy seeing that. I think most universities, especially Ivy Leagues, are really keen to see students who have made a change and a lasting change to a school, to a system that will outlive the student and kind of be their legacy and create change in a more lasting way. So I think though hopefully that will answer that question.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Rachel. We've had quite a few questions coming in about the standardized tests, as one can imagine. So one of the earlier questions this evening was about a particular student case here about taking the leaving certificate in Ireland, so an A-level IB equivalent qualification. And the attendee was asking if a student is offering this kind of externalized, recognized examination, do they still need to take a standardized test in their application?
I would always encourage that. I think the benefit of taking an external test is that you know you have the experience of taking a test in a standardized way in a large setting, and likely and hopefully you've gotten a great grade out of that. I would still recommend taking an SAT or an ACT, some sort of very American focused exam, just because most university admissions committees don't know what that is. Unfortunately, I've never heard of that either. So I think that in order to make yourself a really compelling candidate and have a baseline, and just, I always say, like, make things as easy for the person accepting you as possible. And so, of course, like, it's really exciting and that's definitely an accomplishment. I think that in order to make this process easy to be accepted, I think a student should lean towards additionally taking a standardized test. I will say that having taken that test, you might be really familiar with a lot of the same subjects, a lot of the same the way the questions are timed, that is in the SAT or the ACT, and that automatically puts you at a benefit for testing well and doing well on that exam. So again, I think I always recommend taking a diagnostic, see how that can potentially translate, but also emphasizing that you want to make it easy for the admissions committee to say yes to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And just from a personal anecdote, I've supported over 100 students as well with non-US curricula in applying, including Leaving Cert, A levels, and similar kind of British patterned education or European. And I think in the vast majority of cases, it does not replace the need of a standardized test. And even there is one university has like a flexible system, and only the International Baccalaureate or AP is able to replace the need for standardized testing. So not even A level. So I would say if a university is test mandatory or test required, read that as no matter the curriculum that the student can offer worldwide, the SAT or ACT is therefore needed. Okay, so it is a second type of examination the students need to take, but that is, I think, what it would be required for success in the US. Whilst we're on the theme of standardized testing, um, a student is asking, does submitting no SAT or ACT score significantly affect your application?
I think that, people hate when lawyers say this, but I have to unfortunately say it depends. I think that it's really difficult in a holistic applications process to quantify whether and how much something hurts your application. I'll kind of, be I don't remember what is it, like a broken record. I'll be a broken record and say you just want to make it easy for admissions committees to say yes to you. And so if you don't have an SAT score or an ACT score, I would really compel you to have a very, very robust other elements of your application. I will also caveat that by saying that you are being compared against a number of other applicants who probably have amazing grades as well and amazing extracurriculars. And again, I think that taking standardized testing and doing well in it is more of a benchmark than anything else.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Um, when would you suggest that students should sit the SAT or ACT? Should they commence in year 13, year 12?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that timing is really important because you want to hit that sweet spot between having enough leeway to prepare while not being overwhelmed by the stress of having to take a standardized test. So typically, I try to encourage students to take the exams before their A levels or their final IB program, the diploma program. And I only recommend that because at the end of the day, your grades are still incredibly important, and you want to be able to give it your best shot in those two final years of incredibly important grades. And I think the summer before that begins is a real sweet spot because you're able to put some prep in while giving yourself some runway if you choose to retake it. That's often a common question that we have from both students and parents alike of, which do all SAT scores have to be submitted and what does that look like? And I unfortunately will say it depends again. So some universities will either super score your exam, so that means taking the best elements from every score, and some just take the pure highest score. So there's definitely different options, and that is really dependent on how you're testing. In terms of timing, again, I would still say that the summer before A levels for me is when I try to encourage my students to take it, just because it is a little bit of a reprieve from their studies and also gives them an opportunity to potentially resit.
Great. We have one quite specific question about standardized testing before I move on to another theme, which is ACT and SAT kind of like the HPAT examination in Ireland? Now, the HPAT examination is, to my understanding, an aptitude test. So there's non-verbal reasoning, there's situational judgment, there's numerical, logical reasoning. So it is a test of one's natural aptitude, less so an academic assessment of the knowledge that you've been able to learn and retain. So it's similar in that way, in that it's not necessarily testing curriculum material that you're learning in your school. Um, Rachel can advise better than I can in terms of the structure of each test. But Rachel, would you what's your gut reaction to the sections I've kind of described there for you? Do you feel like the SAT and ACT are similar at all to that, or are they quite standalone?
I think they are similar. I think I wouldn't say I'm familiar enough with that exam to really speak knowledgeably about it. I think likely with most standardized exams, they emphasize a lot of pattern recognition, and so I think that can be a transferable skill if you've done really well in that exam. But I'm not familiar with that exam in and of itself alone to know how transferable that would be.
Yeah. So my gut is that the HPAT is more similar to the UCAT for medicine, as an example, here in the United Kingdom. SAT and ACT are focusing very much on arithmetic of mathematics, comprehension of English, vocabulary knowledge. So it's a bit different to my understanding and interpretation of HPAT. So similar but different. I know it's not really a direct answer, so apologies for that, but I think it's definitely worthwhile taking a bit of a test, have a diagnostic with us, and get to test drive it for yourself and make those similarities. One final one on the standardized testing, which is really important, is how do students sit the SAT or ACT? Like, where might they be able to sit it and how?
I'm pretty sure it's taken online nowadays. I'm not sure if my knowledge is updated because of all these exceptions. But I think there is both an in-person and online component.
Yeah, and these can be taken around the world as well. So, a particular student is asking about in Ireland. There absolutely will be test centres in Ireland. A lot of the time, they are held in schools local to you, hopefully. So there is a college board or the ACT website which will be able to show you your near test centres. They tend to be in the larger cities and sometimes even in rural schools as well, if the school is open to registrants from outside of that school. So, yeah, if you go onto those websites and just search for the test centre finder, and you'll be able to find out then where your local centre is to you. But rest assured, you're able to access that in countries around the world. So let's move on from standardized testing. And we have a question here about any advantage given for students who might take a gap year. Like, does that deepen an extracurricular profile in an advantageous way?
Um, I think that, oh, I hate this being the third time lucky. I think it depends, unfortunately, which is a really difficult answer to give. I think it depends because for multiple reasons. Um, I think the reasoning behind why someone takes a gap year is really informative. And also, it is really informative on how that gap year has formed the student's personal narrative. So I'll give you two different use cases. The first one is in which, a student, I'm not sure, like takes a break from school and is not necessarily doing anything impactful. That's one situation in which I don't think it would help. In another situation, you have a student who, takes the year off to kind of explore, but gets some learning out of it and, starts their own business or nonprofit and something like that. Or even on a smaller scale, really finds a way to give back to the community. I think with most experiences, nothing is as black and white as this is great, this is purely good or purely bad for your application. I think it really informs the student in how they interpret their own personal growth. And I think that can be applied to most scenarios and most situations. Even if I take, for example, a student that I had recently who took a year off to be a full-time carer for their mom, I think that definitely shows an element of growth that they had to face and overcome that they were able to write about in a really meaningful and impactful way. And I think that in general, it really depends on how that gap year contributes to you as an individual and what your kind of lasting legacy can be, whether that's something like in the home or on a larger scale.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. We'll have a few more questions here, one of which is about academic rigor and strength. So, students asking for getting into Harvard, how many A stars do they need to have?
I would say it's a difficult number to quantify. I think that I would caveat this answer with if you're taking a number of different A stars and you're not doing very well at them, but you're just taking A stars for the A stars, I don't think that is necessarily compelling. I think that you have to really balance what you think you're capable of with the potential prestige of that program, because we want to make a fine balance of something that you can handle and something that you can handle versus taking a number of courses that you don't prepare for.
Yeah, it's great. And just in answer to another question about A levels as well, is do universities look at A levels? And they absolutely do look at A levels. So please rest assured, if I mentioned earlier on and caused confusion, all of these qualifications are looked at. It's only through the lens of if a university requires standardized testing do they specifically state it has to be SAT or ACT? So your A levels will be considered and are hugely valuable in the application process because they themselves are already benchmarked as national examinations. So I know in my personal conversations with admissions committees, A levels are looked upon really, really favorably. So, you do have that comfort going in already that you have a great qualification. And if you can dovetail that with a superb SAT or ACT, hopefully then you're, on a really great head start before you even start the other elements of the holistic application. We had a really, really exciting question about, I've lost it now. There's so many questions here. Yes. So choosing Ivy League colleges. So one student here has a specific question about what do you believe, Rachel, is the best Ivy League college for STEM? So something like engineering.
For engineering, I think historically, Princeton has been the Princeton and Cornell have been two of the best Ivy Leagues for those STEM backgrounds. I will say, if you're interested in STEM, there's also a number of other amazing universities that are not technically in the Ivy League that could really fit your profile, whether that's Johns Hopkins, whether that's MIT. All of those are non-Ivy Leagues that really have a strong STEM emphasis.
Yeah, brilliant. And linked to that, I think, then as well, as you said, there's loads of these universities that are great and recognized in their fields. But you mentioned earlier on about demonstrated interest as well and how that is really important. So, how would one demonstrate interest best in a university to convince them that they are a reciprocal match?
Yeah, I think you can do that in a number of ways. I think if you're able to, definitely visiting the campus is a huge way you can show demonstrated interest. A lot of students are a little skeptical that universities take attendance in that way, but it is definitely logged in your file that you have gone to campus. And I try to encourage students to do that not only for that piece of evidence, but also for themselves, because there's such a different atmosphere when you get onto a campus that you can't really see from a virtual tour. If you can only do a virtual tour, I would definitely recommend doing that as well. Demonstrated interest also looks like, interactions with the alumni network, with potential alumni interviews. It also looks like when you research your, for example, like why Dartmouth essay. I think demonstrated interest also looks like really doing a deep dive into what exactly about Dartmouth makes me want to go there. Is it, the ski lift they have on campus? Is it, their outward bounds kind of camping mentality? I think a lot of that plays a piece into demonstrated interest.
And you mentioned alumni. We do have another question actually about, is there a benefit in having a direct relationship formed with alumni?
I think that's always a benefit. I think, again, it's kind of the same half of the coin as a tour, where you're really going to understand more of what the alumni loved about the university. Hopefully, they loved their university, but what they loved about it. And that'll help inform you in your decisions in terms of what makes sense for you. It can also give you key insight into potential, professors or classes or USPs or unique selling points of the universities that really makes an admissions officer excited to read your supplemental essays and excited to say, like, this person is really keen to go to our university.
Brilliant. So we have quite a few questions now about international students studying in the US. And a really interesting question, actually, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this, Rachel, is do you know if you can do an undergrad or postgrad degree online in any of these universities or other Ivy pluses or similar?
I would say that for undergrads, I doubt that they are offered online. I'm sure there are some qualifications and postgrad certifications that you can get online. I will say that part of the aspect of going to an American university, especially an Ivy League, that's really compelling for a lot of students is that campus life. I think unlike a lot of UK schools, a lot of American universities are really focused in on a campus where, your dorm is next to your dining hall, it's next to your professor's office. And that is really a selling point of universities in the States. I think that typically if you're aiming to go to a university solely online, it kind of misses half of the piece of the puzzle, which is the in-person nature of going to that university, especially now in a post-COVID world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to my understanding, it's those professional programs that enable that online study and not necessarily the full undergraduate or postgraduate degree.
Yeah.
Um, and then a follow-up question, which is, can students living overseas indeed go to America and study for the duration of the program?
Um, I guess could what I'm kind of confused at what that
Yeah,
means as
I,
in
I feel that it's a question about, I guess, international mobility. So can non-US students indeed go to the US and study the full 4-year program in the US? And to my answer, it's absolutely yes.
yeah.
Obviously, we have other contexts such as visa applications, and obviously we're in a position of some obviously discussions about visas at the moment in the US, albeit for tourists as opposed to students at the moment. But you know, the US has hundreds of thousands of international students every year across all of their universities. So absolutely yes, as I said, but there are, of course, those final hurdles to navigate, including the visa processing.
Hmm.
Okay. Some final questions now. Thank you all so much for these. These are absolutely wonderful. We have just a handful left. Um, one question going back to the standardized testing. Are subject tests needed anymore, Rachel?
Typically not. I don't find that those tests are mandatory in the same way that general standardized testing is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just checking. Yes, so I answered that one, answered this one. Oh, brilliant question. Are any of the early admission scenarios based on unconditional offers? So, therefore, not stating what grades a student might need to get to convert that offer to a place?
I will say that besides early decision, the vast majority of admissions offers are conditional on the fact that you will complete the rest of your time in school with comparable grades, and you typically won't, cheat or get suspended or anything, barring an extenuating circumstance. That is probably the only condition, but there's not any completely unreasonable conditions that are typically placed on those offers.
Yeah, I've personally seen students who miss their predicted grades. In the UK, that can be the difference between a place and being made unsuccessful on results day. In my experience for the US, students have been able to not meet their, I guess, not conditions, but not follow the trajectory that the predicted grades were, and still be able to enroll. But there really is a policy in place to just ensure that students are retaining the quality that they were kind of bestowed, the confidence in their teacher recommendations, and trying to avoid an informal term called senioritis.
Yeah.
So, skipping class or not doing their exams or tests just because they have the comfort of an offer. So, you do need to maintain a good academic standing, even though it doesn't have to necessarily be perfect as to what was originally predicted.
Mm.
Penultimate question. Do you have any recommendations for a good university which combines engineering and business and finance, I guess, as combined majors or combination of classes?
In the Ivy League specifically or in general, I think for the Ivy League, definitely UPenn is really business focused. Obviously Harvard. When I think about that, the first university that came to mind actually is probably Duke. I think Duke really encourages, a combination of STEM and any international element, and also Purdue. I feel like Purdue has a pretty great reputation for engineers who are multifaceted. And I'll also throw in Rice there, who's great, a huge STEM background, and encourages kind of a multidisciplinary learning style.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. The final question is about the success rates that I mentioned, the acceptances versus the global average, and what percentage of our applicants are through early admission. I don't have those statistics immediately available, but I will encourage that you reach out to our team. Sam and our wonderful team in consultancy will be able to answer that with specificity. But I guess a question to you, Rachel, is, without going into a huge amount of detail, perhaps, but with the students that you've personally worked with over the years, how many students do you feel are applying to those early deadlines? Like, would you say a majority of your students try to put an application in early to take
I w
advantage of those statistics?
Yes, I would say a lot of them, if they start early enough and they're prepared enough, I really encourage them to apply early. On the other hand, I do have a large majority of students who maybe are really torn and haven't gotten the chance to visit the States and don't know exactly what university will fit them best, and therefore they don't want to lock themselves into an early action or an early decision application. And in that case, they're more than happy to comply with the normal deadline, which is around January 1st. Like coming from a strategy perspective, if a student is really keen on a university, I always try to recommend that they apply early for the university they think they'll fit best at.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think there's also added benefits to applying early, not only with the statistical advantage, but to have an offer mid-December help students just go into the remainder of their academic year with confidence, knowing that they've got a place or an offer to go somewhere. So no longer do they have to wait until the end of March or even later in different systems. So the mental load that can be lifted by bringing one's timeline forward, placing earlier applications, receiving earlier offers, it does the world of wonders to students, and then the ability to then balance all of the workload, but focusing on those final examinations that you'll need to take in your last year. So definitely a statistical, but also personal benefit.
I would also add to that in saying that even if a student is planning on applying early and we get to that deadline and we have all the materials and they choose to say that they would prefer to follow the regular deadline, that is in and of itself still an advantage because at that point they have prepared their personal statement and at least some supplemental essays, and that can still have them walking into in America Thanksgiving break, but usually just the holiday season kind of with more confidence in which they don't have to spend, New Year's Eve writing all these essays and editing and trying to get a response from me. And so I think that is also an added mental benefit.
Yeah. And one can argue does demonstrate some interest in that you are ready and that you are applying early and not clearly a last minute applicant on December 31st. So, yeah, definitely does show maturity and preparedness. So those are the end of our questions. Thank you so much to Rachel. And thank you so much for everyone who's online. If there are any further questions after today's webinar, then please do reach out. You can see there how to contact us on our website or telephone, and we'd be absolutely delighted to help you. So thank you all so much for your time this evening, and wishing you all the best with your applications. And do reach out to us. So we'd be very, very happy to continue conversations with you all, specifically and bespokely about your own applications moving forward. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.